Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 52, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I feel a bit as though I've reached the end of a marathon. Canning season is mostly over. I only have pumpkin left to do, and that can wait a couple of weeks. I needed to get tomatoes done and made into salsa and out of the freezer because we have pork coming. We took our pigs up to the processor a couple of weeks ago, and we will be getting the finished pork products back soon, and I needed the freezer space, so I had to get the tomatoes out of there. I did 40 quarts of salsa over the weekend, and that should be enough, I hope. Added to what we have left over from last year. My husband goes through about a quart of salsa a week. And we had, if we didn't have a frost, we had something close to it. It was about 31 degrees Fahrenheit when I got up this morning. So I would suspect that the tomatoes are probably done for, or if they're not done for, they will be soon, because we may have another frost tomorrow morning. And the reason I'm talking so much about canning is because I've really shoved sewing to the side during canning season. It happens every year. I have to get all the canning done, and some of it is time sensitive, so I don't get as much sewing done. And that caused me enough stress that when I finished the salsa, I decided that today would be devoted to sewing, and that's what I've done all day. I have 1,000 projects that I could be working on. I decided that in order to ease back into sewing, I would give myself some quick wins. So I cut out a long sleeve laundry day tee from some rayon spandex fabric, and I also cut out a Jaylee Natalie top from some French terry, and those are both put together. I actually didn't do quite as much sewing as I did serging. My poor serger has been neglected for several months. So I ran both of those up on the serger with a little bit of work on the Jaylee Natalie collar on my sewing machine. And those are ready to hem, which I will do on my cover stitch machine probably tomorrow. So we'll see how much more sewing I get done this week. I have a couple of quilts to finish, but I might wait on those and knock out a couple of zipper pouches or something, just to give myself a few more quick wins. I'm going to be traveling in October. I'm going to Cleveland to visit my mother. She was in the hospital recently, hopefully nothing serious. She's feeling better now, but I'm going back there to make sure that she's doing okay. And it worked out that at the same time, my 40th high school reunion will be held while I'm there, so I'm going to attend that. And then I'm home back in Montana for a week, and then I go to Tacoma to take my sewing classes at the Sewing and Design School there. I'm taking the coat making class with Ryla Spode. She was a guest on the podcast a couple of months ago. And then I'm doing a trouser drafting class with Kenneth D. King. And I'm really excited about both of those classes. I bought the most beautiful emerald green cashmere and wool blend for my coat. I have to pick that up from the dry cleaner tomorrow and find some lining fabric to go with it. And being able to get away and take those classes is going to be a real treat for me. I'm hoping to maintain the existing podcast schedule. However, I was supposed to have an interview this week with someone who lives in Florida, and I don't know how or if she was affected by the hurricane, so that interview may not happen. If it turns out that I just can't get a podcast up while I'm traveling, that'll give you an opportunity to do some catching up on past episodes. My mother does have a sewing machine at her house. She sewed a lot when we were growing up, so I may take a jelly roll with me and make a jelly roll quilt or do something else while I'm there visiting her, but we'll just have to see how things play out. And I'm just feeling a bit relieved and a bit less stressed now that canning season is over and gardening season is over, and I'm not being a slave to my canning schedule. So we're going to get back to talking about sewing. And today's episode is all about Serger presser feet. So if you own a Serger, I hope that you will find this episode interesting and useful. If you don't own a Serger, but maybe you're thinking about buying one or you buy one at some point in the future, I hope that you will come back to this episode as a reference for some information on the presser feet that I really like to use on my Sergers. So let's jump in and explore Serger presser feet. Today I want to talk about Serger presser feet. And in this episode at least, I'm going to confine myself to talking about Serger presser feet, with the understanding that some Sergers are also combo machines and can be converted to cover stitch machines. And cover stitch machines come with their own set of presser feet, so that will probably end up being yet another episode on presser feet. But today I'm going to stick with Serger presser feet. I will confess to being a bit of a presser foot junkie. I have lots of presser feet for my Bernina 880 sewing machine, and I have, I think, every presser foot that's available for my Bernina L860 Serger, and I've used most of them. I don't just collect feet for the sake of collecting feet. I also like to use them, so I've tried out most of them. The extra large piping foot is the only one I haven't had a chance to play with yet. And I will try to make this as general as I can, with the understanding that not everybody has the same. And where I can note specific differences between brands, I will try to do that. So let's jump in and look at presser feet for Sergers. Typically, your Serger will come with what's called an all-purpose foot or a general Serger foot. And this is the foot that you'll have on the machine when you're doing basic Serger stitches like a 4-thread overlock or a 3-thread overlock, where you're not involving any additional materials or threads. You're just doing your basic seaming or edge finishing. It's also worth noting that on many of the Sergers, the general serging foot also has a tape guide or an elastic guide. And we will talk more about elasticator feet in a little bit, but I want to note that you don't necessarily need to buy a special foot if you want to attach ribbon. Let's say you're seaming a knit garment and you want to reinforce the shoulder seams. I like to use organza ribbon there, 1/4-inch organza ribbon. Some people like to use 1/4-inch clear elastic. Some people like to use 1/4-inch satin ribbon. Whatever you're using to reinforce that seam to keep it from stretching, oftentimes you can feed that material, feed that ribbon or elastic directly through the front of the foot. And you'll have to look. Sometimes there's a screw with a little guide that you can move back and forth so that it snugs up against the ribbon to keep it straight as it feeds into the foot. But it's worth checking out your general purpose foot to see if you've got that capability. I know on the L890, the Bernina top of the line machine, the general purpose foot does not have the capability of feeding 1/4-inch elastic or ribbon through the front of the foot. And I believe that's because it's a combo foot. That is a combo machine. You can also get a clear general purpose foot. The general purpose foot that comes with the machine is probably a metal foot, but a clear plastic foot is also available for most models or for many models. And that clear presser foot allows you to see what you're doing. I will tell you that I am not as fond of the clear presser feet as I am of the metal presser feet. I have the clear presser feet. I have used them. I find that they don't provide sufficient pressure on the material when it's feeding to keep it from slipping around. So if you want to use a clear presser foot, just be aware that you may have to adjust the presser foot pressure on your machine in order to use those feet successfully. I tend not to use them, but that's just my personal preference. The blind stitch foot is one of those feet that you might be saying to yourself, well, I don't want to do blind hems on my serger. I want to do them on my sewing machine. And that is certainly your choice, but I would encourage you to at least try making a blind hem on your serger. You might be pleasantly surprised at how it looks. The serger will finish off the raw edge and sew the blind hem at the same time. And that can save you a step. I know that when I had my little jukey serger, I would often finish the raw edge on the serger and then go to the sewing machine and make my blind hem. And if you have a blind hem foot for your serger, you can do both of those operations in one pass. So it's worth experimenting with, especially if you're doing, I can think of maybe hemming a pair of Ponte pants. That would be a great place where you would want to finish the edge and make a blind hem at the same time. The blind stitch foot can also be used to make a flat lock hem that is visible on the public side of the garment. So when you think of flat lock stitches, you think of one side being a ladder stitch and the other side being a more decorative stitch. If you set your machine up with your blind stitch foot to make a flat lock stitch such that the ladders appear on the outside of the work or the outside of the garment, then you can get a decorative hem on the outside of your garment. And I'm thinking perhaps you want to hem something in fleece, maybe the cuffs of a jacket, a fleece jacket. This would be a place where you could do a decorative ladder stitch and make the hem part of the design element of the garment. Let's talk about that elasticator foot. And let's say that you don't have a tape guide or an elastic guide on the front of your general purpose serger foot. You will have to use an elasticator foot. The elasticator foot has an opening at the front of the foot. Usually there is some kind of tension adjustment and width adjustment so that you can adjust the opening for the elastic to feed in. I think on the Bernina machines it goes up to 20 millimeters, which is about 3/4 of an inch. And there is also, as I mentioned, the tension adjustment on the top of the foot, and that controls how much stretch is applied to the elastic as it feeds into the foot. So if you want to apply elastic with just a little bit of stretch to it, you would loosen that. If you want to apply the maximum amount of stretch to the elastic as it feeds in, you would tighten that knob. If you do a lot of lingerie sewing or swimwear or athletic wear, this might be a foot that you want to invest in, as it will help you to attach and apply elastic quickly and easily. The beading and sequin foot is one that you might want to get if you do a lot of sewing for costumes or fancy dresses or princess outfits for little girls, where you're using a lot of tulle or delicate fabrics and you want to attach a string of beads or a strand of sequins or other decorative beading along the edge of some tulle. The sequin and beading foot is going to make your life a lot easier by managing that strand of beads or sequins as it feeds into the serger and overcasting it. So I've seen this done with very delicate strands of beads and a rolled edge. It makes a lovely beaded edge. I've also seen it done on tulle with strands of sequins. If you're a grandparent that sews for a grandchild, I can imagine that you would be the hero if you were to create some lovely princess outfits and fancy skirts using beaded edges and sequined edges. The cording foot is similar to the beading and sequin foot, but a little bit different. This foot typically has an opening on the front of the foot, similar to a tape guide, except that it's a round opening, and you feed a piece of cording or a piece of wire through that opening, and it keeps the wire or cording in place while you serge over it. Why would you need a cording foot? Well, if you ever wanted to make your own custom wire edge ribbon, this is the foot that you will need to do that. We have done this in some of my classes with 24 or 26 gauge wire, where we fed the wire into the cording foot, into the front of the foot, and used a rolled hem setting on the serger to make the rolled hem over the wire as it fed into the serger. And when you're all finished, you cut the wire and you finish serging over it, and lo and behold, you have custom wire edge ribbon. So if you are perhaps doing something for a wedding or a special occasion where you want a particular custom ribbon that you can't find in the stores, you can certainly make your own. You can do the same thing with monofilament fishing line instead of wire, and do it on the edge of tulle, and you can create lovely wavy three-dimensional edges to your tulle skirts for the little girls in your life. Or imagine making a rolled hem over a heavier piece of cording. I believe on my cording foot I can use cords up to 6 millimeters wide. So doing a rolled hem over a heavier piece of cording to give a piece of fabric some weight or something to hold it down or anchor it, you could use the cording foot for that as well. But really making the wire-edged ribbon, and it's one of my favorite uses for the cording foot. The piping foot is another serger foot that I tend to use quite a bit. And it is useful for, as its name implies, making piping, but it's also incredibly useful for serging zippers onto a piece of fabric. But let's talk about using it for piping first. Bernina has 2 different sizes of piping foot. We might run into a little bit of confusion here because Baby Lock calls their cording and piping foot the same thing. It doesn't appear to me that Baby Lock has a foot that will feed cording in like the Bernina machines do. But as far as I can tell, the end result is the same, whether you use the cording foot on the Baby Lock or the cording foot on the Bernina. It's just that the feet are shaped a little bit differently. And if I have that incorrect, someone please let me know, give me the correct information. You can either email me or leave a comment. In any case, if you have to make yards and yards and yards of piping, you can do it on your sewing machine using a zipper foot. That's probably the traditional method, but if you have a serger, you can make piping on the serger, and it turns out just as nice as it does on the sewing machine, with the added bonus of the pieces of fabric, the edges of the fabric being finished with an overlock stitch. Bernina has 3 different piping feet depending on what size piping you're using. There's a small, a medium, and the extra large, or the small, the large, and the extra large. It appears that Baby Lock only has 1 size cording/piping foot. And I don't mean to leave Juki owners out of the equation here. Juki also sells an 8-foot set for their sergers, and that set contains many of the same feet that I'm talking about here. I just happen to be most familiar with Bernina's because I own one, and Baby Lock's because I've also taught serger classes with Baby Lock machines. So back to the piping foot. It can be used for making piping, obviously, but it's also incredibly useful for attaching zippers. And I've used this most when I make zipper pouches because it will attach the zipper to the top edge of the fabric and finish the inside edge. And if you've ever made zipper pouches where the zipper and the raw edge are aligned, sometimes that raw edge of the fabric will start to fray. And it looks unsightly on the inside of the bag if it doesn't, especially if it doesn't have a lining or some other way of enclosing that raw edge of fabric. So what happens is instead of feeding piping through the groove on the underside of the foot, you're actually placing that groove over the teeth of the zipper, almost like you would if you were sewing in an invisible zipper with your sewing machine. The groove rides over the teeth of the zipper, and it, in some cases, depending on how you have your cutting width set, it will cut off a little bit of the edge of the zipper and overcast the zipper and the fabric edge together. The one drawback to doing this is because of the length of the foot, you often have to use a much longer zipper than you normally would if you were inserting a zipper with a sewing machine. So let's say you're making a 10-inch wide zipper pouch. You should probably use a 14-inch zipper to give yourself enough room at the beginning and the end to get that presser foot set over the zipper before you actually start serging. It is a pretty slick method though, so give it a try. Sometimes I insert my zippers with my sewing machine. Sometimes I do it with the serger. It just depends on the pouch pattern, and it depends on what kind of end result I'm looking for. So my goal is always to have as many tools in my arsenal as possible so that I have the greatest number of options to choose from when I'm making something. I do have the Bernina extra large piping foot, but I haven't had a chance to use it. If you do a lot of home deck and you have a Bernina machine, that might be a foot that you want to get because it allows you to do piping up to 10 millimeters wide, which is pretty chunky. If you've been serging for any length of time, you're aware that serger feet tend to be longer than sewing machine presser feet, and that can make serging around curves or rounded corners a little bit tricky. So in the last couple of years, all of the major manufacturers have come out with a curve foot, which is a serger foot that is shorter than the standard presser foot, general serging presser foot. A lot of the companies also have a clear version of the curve foot. Again, you'll have to try it and see what you think. I don't typically use the clear version of my curve presser foot, but I do very much like the curve presser foot. One of my daughters asked me if I would make her a supply of those makeup rounds that she could use and wash so that she wasn't throwing out cotton rounds every time she used one. So I used my AccuQuilt cutter with the circle die to cut out 2-inch circles, and one side was cotton fleece and the other side was cotton terry. And then I serged them together so that the two layers were connected. And I'll tell you, if you do this, especially if you're doing several hundred at a time like I was doing, you want to use the narrowest stitch width on your serger that you can. And you also want to loosen the presser foot pressure because that will make going around those curves even easier. And if you have the curved presser foot, it will make it that much easier. I was able to do several hundred because not only did I do them for my daughter, but she volunteered me to do them for a friend of hers too. And I think by the time it was all said and done, I had done something like 300 of them. You do get into a production rhythm and it doesn't take quite as long as you might think, but it is made much easier with that curve foot. I sometimes will leave the curve foot on my machine depending on what I'm doing and just use it for general serging, but not being as long as your standard presser foot, sometimes you can run into problems with the way the fabric is feeding. So again, it's one of those things that you'll have to experiment with, but I really do love the curve foot. The gathering foot is one that you may or may not decide that you need, depending on how much gathering you do on your serger. I will tell you that it is possible to gather on your serger without having a specialty foot. A lot of it is controlled by the differential feed and the needle tensions rather than by any particular foot. But there is a gathering foot that allows you to gather and simultaneously attach your gathered fabric to a second piece of flat fabric. And that gathering foot basically has an upper portion and a lower portion. And the upper portion does the gathering, the lower portion feeds the flat piece of fabric. And as it goes through the serger, those two layers of fabric are serged together. I used this on an apron pattern to gather and attach a ruffle to another piece of fabric, and it does work. It takes a fair bit of experimentation to get the gathered piece to gather as much or as little as you want, but it is pretty slick that you can attach the gathered fabric to the flat fabric simultaneously. Again, most of the manufacturers have a gathering foot as well as a shirring foot. I will leave it to the purists to argue about what the difference is between gathering and shirring. The shirring foot may be better for lighter, more delicate fabrics, but again, I haven't played with those two enough to see what the difference is between them, but there may be a significant difference. I just don't know. Baby Lock does have a couple of specialty feet for their sergers, and if anybody from Bernina is listening to this podcast, I would love it if you would maybe make some of these presser feet for the Bernina machines. The first one that I would like to see is a lace application foot, and it has I guess you could do this with a blind hem foot, but it's got a guide on it that keeps the knife from cutting off the header of a piece of lace trim. And it looks like it would provide a really nice edge to a piece of lace that you were attaching to a garment or an apron or something. I can think of lots of possibilities for that one. Baby Lock also has a Teflon serger foot. And if you've ever tried to serge on vinyl, you may be aware that sometimes it can get hung up and it's not pretty. So I love the idea of having a Teflon serger foot that will glide nicely over vinyl or faux leather or other thick materials. The Baby Lock website suggests that it can also be used on heavier fabrics like fleece and denim or on multiple layers. I have a Teflon foot on my industrial Necky sewing machine, and it makes my life so much easier. I can think of lots of ways that a Teflon foot might make my serging be more enjoyable as well. So I would love to see a Teflon foot for the Berninas. I think we've covered just about every serger foot that's available for the serger only machines. As I mentioned, I will probably do a separate episode with cover stitch feet because those are really a specialty product. Not everybody has a combo machine, and those feet really deserve their own episode, so we'll do that sometime in the future. If you have any questions or feedback on this or any other episode, I would encourage you to email me, janet@janetzabo.com. You can also use the fan mail feature on the podcast download, or you can leave a comment on the show notes page. I do try to respond to the feedback that I get. I'd love it if you left a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts. That really helps other people find the podcast. Show notes are available on the podcast website, which is www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. You can also visit my website at www.janetzabo.com with links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website as well as my blog, where I write 2 to 3 times a week about life here in Montana and what's going on. That's the place to see pictures of my sewing projects when I finally, after canning season is over, get a chance to sew again. Look for some interviews coming in the next couple of weeks, as well as more informative podcasts on sewing techniques and things that I found as I wander around the universe of sewing. It's a big place and there's a lot to cover. So until our next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.